Hey, I'm Jesse. Let's have a devotion. We're going to look at John chapter 1, verses 6 through 13, picking up with what we've been looking at so far in the last couple of devotions this week, reviewing the foundational teachings of the Redemption Church. Welcome home. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was created through him, and yet the world did not recognize him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, he gave them the right to be children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of natural descent, or of the will of the flesh or the will of man, but of God. Now, we get a quick glimpse at John the Baptist in verses 6 through 9. John the Baptist's backstory is in a series taught in the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 2, and we gave a pretty full exposition of that in our series, Dear Skeptical Friend. So look at our archive and find the Dear Skeptical Friend series, and it's pretty early on in that. Let me see if I can back up. We timed that series in such a way that we would see the Christmas story in the Gospel of Luke, and then we would arrive at the story of the resurrection in Luke 24 just in time for Easter. So yeah, that started in, it goes back to like devotion 859 or 865. So Luke, what was the first one was Dear Skeptical Friend. The second sermon was Light Bursting In. The first devotion of that series was 859. And it continued all the way through devotion 954, which came from the book of Acts, because both of those were written by Luke to his friend Theophilus. So there's a glimpse of John the Baptist in these verses, and there's more to be said about this. Again, see Dear Skeptical Friend for our exposition of Luke chapter 2. He's careful to point out that John the Baptist was not the light himself. He came as a witness to testify about the light so that all might believe through him. That's John the Baptist's role. That's why he was born. Even his birth, John the Baptist's birth, which, by the way, it's a different John from our author here, John. This John is the author of course, John's Gospel. He's also the author of 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. And members of the Redemption Church, we're going to read more of John's writing when we arrive at the book of Revelation. So after this series, we're going to continue in our year of prophecy study with the book of Ezekiel. And so that's been kicking my tail as I prep that content, because it's just hard stuff, man. But John the Baptist was a different John. And there's even another John among the disciples. So his job was to testify about the light. That's written twice in verses 7 and 8. And what I like about John the Baptist and his ministry is that we have something in common with him. We may not have quite the miraculous backstory to the circumstances preceding our births, but we likewise have no higher purpose for our lives than to testify about the light so that others would come from darkness to light. And you remember from yesterday's devotion in verses 4 and 5, in him was life, and that life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. This is the light about which John testifies. He came as a witness to testify about the light so that all might believe through him. That was John the Baptist's ministry and hope. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. You as a Christian are not the source of light, but you testify about the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. That's a powerful promise. It's a prophecy about the nature of Christ. We've established early in the opening verses of John that he existed with God in the beginning, and now he's coming into the world. it's important to distinguish between verses 9 and 10. We're no longer talking about John the Baptist when we get to verse 10. Verse 10 is about Jesus. He was in the world, and the world was created through him, and yet the world did not recognize him. This is kind of like the roller coaster analogy that we talked about, in which the designer of the roller coaster rides it. He is the creator of all the cosmos, and now he steps down to be with us. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Yet the world did not recognize him. Isn't that fascinating? See what stark contrast the story of Jesus stands with ancient pagan mythologies. That the world did not recognize him. I mean, you may be my skeptical friend. You've tuned in for the last couple of devotions, and you might be struggling with this notion of logic personified. But would you consider this? This might actually help you believe a little bit more. You know what we did to logic personified? We crucified him. That does kind of sound like what we would do, doesn't it? If rationality himself took on flesh and walked among us, we would totally kill him. And that's exactly what happened. They didn't recognize him. They didn't recognize him. He was not born in pomp and circumstance and regalia. He was born in humble circumstances, in a manger, God in flesh, in a feed trough for an animal. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. Now, here's where John, whose audience was largely Gentiles, is distinguishing how he was even the Jewish authorities didn't accept Jesus. Right? You had many of the early converts were all Jews. Salvation is first for the Jew and then for the Gentile. By the time of John's writing, however, the Gentile church is exploding. And Paul's missionary journeys had gone to various cities where he would start at the synagogue, and the synagogue would kick him out. And they would go to the Gentiles. The Gentiles would get saved like crazy. And so Jesus went to his own. As a little boy, he would teach in the synagogue, and there were some people who believed, but among the religious elites, among the Jewish religious leadership, we've got record of Joseph of Arimathea, and we've got Nicodemus. There are not very many examples of spiritual leaders in ancient Israel who believed Jesus. But to all who did receive him, he gave them the right to be children of God. To those who believe in his name, who were born not of natural descent or the will of the flesh or the will of man, but of God. So this is to distinguish between the hereditary nature of the old covenant and now the nature of the new covenant. For more on this, please see a sermon series that I did called How Christians Are Made, in which I exposited the book of Romans, verse by verse. Because in the book of Romans, we see how salvation worked in the Old Testament, how it works in the New Testament. Now, because God elected Israel as his chosen old covenant people, now, because of Jesus, Gentiles can call upon the name of the Lord and be saved. It's hard to do this because the Romans is a theological mountain. But if I had to boil it down to one distinctive, borrowing heavily from the teachings of Dr. John Piper on this, that is my take. Now, John, writing to Gentiles, says, look, it's not about those who, it's not about lineage. This is consistent with what Paul writes in Romans 9. Right? Not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. It's not about the descendants of Abraham. It's through Ishmael that the covenant will be passed. This is about people who receive him. All right, to everyone who does receive him, he gives the right to be children of God. And it's not people who were born of natural descent. It's not about your lineage. It's not about your pedigree. And it's not even about the will of the flesh or the will of man. This is to say, it's nothing to do with sexual reproduction. It has nothing to do even with what your flesh desires. This is about God. And this is a precursor to what Jesus would teach Nicodemus in John chapter 3, the most famous verse in the whole Bible. For God loved the world in this way, that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him would not die, but have everlasting life. He had told Nicodemus that he must be born again. Born this way. It's a popular adage, and it's used, and I believe abused politically. I think that the gay community did a huge disservice to the black race, appropriating the playbook of the civil rights movement and pretending like your sexual proclivities are immutable as your race, making anyone with any permutation of any sexual desire somehow a protected class in its own, as if your sexual desires define you as a type of person, despite the utter dearth of any kind of research to prove this. Truth of the matter is, we're all born this way, and you must be born again. You can become a child of God because Jesus gives you the right as you receive him, as you call on his name. See that? You're born not of natural descent, not the will of the flesh or the will of man, but of God's will. You're born again by the will of God as his Spirit draws on you. You know if I'm talking to you because you believe this right now. If you believe this right now, it's describing you in this moment being born again. To all who did receive him, he gave them the right to be children of God. His use of the word children is incredible. It carries with it immense weight. It means that you are a co-heir with Christ. Paul would write on this theme in greater detail. It also speaks to the permanence of salvation. Okay, the 5 points of Calvinism share something in common. They share a couple of things in common with the articles of the Remonstrance, the teachings of Arminianism, but they are total depravity. We're all totally depraved. Okay, that was one that they shared in common with the Arminians. Unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and then finally, perseverance of the saints, which John Calvin may have probably preferred that P be preservation of the saints. Salvation is adoption into the family of God. It is to become a child of God. When my children misbehave, I discipline them, but I don't disown them. To all who did receive him, he gave the right to be children of God, to those who believe in his name. So we see here that John the Baptist's mission was similar to John, our author's mission. John the Baptist testified about the light so that all might believe through him. John's own gospel would culminate in the revelation of his purpose for writing toward the end of the Gospel of John. These things have been written so that you may believe, and by believing have life in his name. And if you believe in him, if you receive him, you believe in his name, you are given the right to be a child of God, regardless of your physical descent or even the will of the flesh. It's the will of God that you would be adopted and become a child of God. It speaks to the permanence of salvation, perseverance of the saints, as it's known since Reformation days. This is vital. This is the mission of Jesus on the earth. John would also go on to describe the mission of Christ to destroy the works of the devil in his later epistles. Believe in God. Call upon his name. Become a child of God by way of adoption. Not through an inheritance, not through pedigree, but through the sheer will of God. If you believe that the words I've said today are true, as I just read the text, John's gospel, you are born again. Confess it now. Jesus is Lord. Believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead, and you will be saved. Let us know at redemptionwashington.com if you've given your life to Christ today.